I'd like you to put your hands together for Stephen Chavura.
Great to be here. What an honour. Such an important topic, that is the identity of Australia. And as Harry said, I've been speaking out against multiculturalism now for 20 years at least. In fact, the first public speech I ever gave about 20 years ago was against the ideology of multiculturalism. You see, I grew up in Bankstown. I grew up in an area in Sydney where you really see what multiculturalism is all about. And it's not just a new Thai restaurant opening around the corner. It's about walking down the streets and being afraid because you might look at the wrong group of boys the wrong way and wind up getting bashed up or chased or something like that. Bankstown in the 90s was a rough place. And for those who don't think that white Australians could ever experience racism, try be a white Australian in Bankstown, maybe today or certainly in the 1990s. I've certainly begged to differ. So I know a little bit about what I talk about when I talk about multicultural Australia. I'll get back to that a little bit later. So certainly when Federation takes place in 1901, you could describe Australia as an ethno-state. At the census taken that year, we estimate that around about 98% of Australians were of an Anglo-Celtic background. And that remains strongly the case right up to World War II. And of course, in World War II, in order to boost the population for security reasons and also to have people to be able to be involved in post-World War II reconstruction and a new sort of industrialization process for Australia, we bring over, ultimately post-World War II, millions of migrants from Europe. My grandparents on my father's side were part of those. If our names were matronymic, I'd be Stephen Rogers, but they're patronymic, and so I'm Stephen Chavura, a Polish surname. My grandfather on my dad's side was a Polish man who married a Ukrainian woman, so I myself am a product of that. Mark Lopez points out in his history of the origins of the policy of multiculturalism, which is one of the best history books I've ever read. I think it's a classic. He points out that, first, that when the Europeans came over here post-World War II and earlier, they came over under a policy of assimilation. And it was very explicit. The Labor government was very explicit. They actually said, we do not want cultural pluralism. We want a monoculture. I'll get back to this ideal of a monoculture and immigration and assimilation a little bit later. But by the time you get to the 1970s, as you all know, assimilation is very much on the nose because there's a very sort of strong anti-racist discourse that's emerged out of World War II and in the American desegregation movement. And there's more to it than that. Mark Lopez covers it all in his book. But what Mark Lopez points out is that in his history is that multiculturalism was always pushed and championed by a small group of elites who found their way into key public policy roles. There are only ever a handful of them, but they were highly organized and they knew how to get an agenda across. As Lopez says, multiculturalism was developed by a small number of academics, social workers, and activists, initially located on the fringe of the political arena of migrant settlement and welfare. And yet they managed spectacularly to succeed in changing public policy, changing laws by getting into just key positions, whether it was speechwriters, working in the sort of the public service and things like that, getting the ear of prime ministers. They were phenomenally successful. And of course, it speaks to that famous quote from Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, that all you need to change the world, in this case, all you need to change Australia, is just a handful of really active and dedicated individuals. You don't need a majority of people. Far from it. Far from it. And that's precisely what happened with the ideology of multiculturalism. And I think, and I'll get back to this later, we must talk about, every time you use the word multiculturalism, prefix it with the word ideology because it is an ideology. If you wanted me to talk more about that, if you go onto YouTube, I've got a 1-hour speech that I gave at the IPA against the ideology of multiculturalism. Australians as a whole, certainly in the early years of this policy, were positively opposed to the ideology of multiculturalism. They just felt instinctively that there was something wrong with it. In 1988, the Fitzgerald report into Australian immigration. Now, this report said that Australians, by and large, are in favour of immigration, but it had numerous things to say about the ideology of multiculturalism. Here's what it says. Quote, "Our consultants' research on the question of multiculturalism suggests that, compared with the 1950s, there's a much better tolerance of ethnic diversity, particularly among more affluent, but this tolerance does not entail majority support for multiculturalism. The Anglo-Australian sense of the superiority of their culture, previously manifest in the policy of assimilation, is disowned by governments, but remains as a significant factor in the community," end quote. So this 1988 report effectively says that Australians actually don't like multiculturalism. And it goes on and says that Australians see it as little more than an exercise in social engineering. So it's been popular at the policy level, but not so much at the popular level. In the same year, 1988, great year, the Liberal Party released its One Australia plan, which sought to reduce Asian immigration, turn immigration away from family reunion and towards skilled migration, and to abolish the policy of multiculturalism. So by today's standards, that was a really radical plan that they had to actually abolish this idea of multiculturalism. I'll get back to the Liberal government very soon. So I think, as most of us here know, things didn't quite turn out that way. In the same year, Bob Hawke gave many speeches in 1988 praising multiculturalism as a policy. In his 1988 speech at the Opera House on Australia Day, he said, "We are, and essentially we remain, a nation of immigrants, a nation drawn from 130 nationalities in Australia, and there is no hierarchy of descent. There must be no privilege of origin." He went on in another speech saying something very, very similar to that. And note what he does there. In 1988, he effectively demotes the Anglo-Celtic heritage of Australia to just one heritage among others. I'll get back to Bob Hawke a little bit later. As some of you might know, that Bob Hawke very candidly admitted in 1994 that big immigration and big non-Anglo-Celtic European immigration was a bipartisan policy. As Peter Credlin pointed out in an article she wrote in 2021, I'll quote Peter Credlin here. She says, "Back in 1994, launching a book of essays, former Prime Minister Bob Hawke made the remarkably frank admission that immigration policy had effectively been a conspiracy by the political establishment against the Australian public. Hawke agreed with one author's observation that most voters wanted immigration reduced and that the parties had deliberately kept it out of public debate, saying, indeed, there had been, and this is quoting Bob Hawke, quote, an implicit pact between the major parties to implement broad policies on immigration that they know are not generally endorsed by the electorate, and that they have done this by keeping the subject off the political agenda," end quote. What is more important to a country than the migration program that determines the character of that nation? Like, what is that? We're talking about the very identity of a nation. Can there be a more crucial, important public policy than that? Who you bring in and the character of the community and over time the nation that emerges. I can't think of anything more important than that, other than possibly national security. As we've learned over the years, you can't separate national security from immigration either. And yet both parties kept this off the public conversation and went about doing things that I'm about to describe. Under the Hawke-Keating government, several changes to immigration policy were made that were clearly not in the nation's interest. As Catherine Betts, a scholar of immigration, explains, up until 1989, Australian immigration policy was based on ministerial discretion. This gave the executive the power to decide policy without review either in Parliament or the courts. But during the 1980s, the context changed. Many more would-be immigrants were already on Australian soil on a temporary basis, and if they were rejected, they could appeal to the courts. Ministerial discretion was hard to defend in court, and selection criteria were progressively widened by court judgments. The Hawke government compounded these difficulties by a number of unwise policy decisions. By 1996, the immigration program that the Howard government inherited lacked a clear economic rationale, was dominated by family reunion, as it still is, brought in many migrants who needed welfare support, and was very open to fraud. It was also, again, unpopular. The Howard years were transitional years. And although it tightened immigration, although the Howard government tightened immigration early on, it implemented substantial migration growth towards its end. By the time the Howard government lost office, it had doubled the annual permanent intake. Immigration and big Australia enthusiast Richard Alsop, then of the IPA, could boast that the Liberal governments were always bigger immigration governments than Labor, and was delighted to speak of, quote, the massive expansion of the immigration program under the Howard government, end quote. Of course, Howard is remembered for tough rhetoric on illegal immigration. But according to Leith Van Onselen, quote, former Prime Minister John Howard played a bait and switch on the Australian people, scapegoating and slamming the door shut on comparatively small numbers of refugees arriving by boat, while throwing open the door to economic migrants arriving by air. During Howard's first 3 years in office, Australia's annual net overseas migration averaged 86,000 persons per year. In its last 3 years in office, it averaged 188,000 individuals per year and has been turbocharged ever since, end quote. It was also during the Howard years that the universities were given the power to determine how many overseas students they could accept. So that was previously up to the discretion of the government, of the executive. It was handed over to the universities. And of course, when you ask a university, how many overseas full fee paying students do you need? The answer is always going to be more. Let me just go into a few thoughts. I'll get out of sort of the historical part. And in 2018, a Lowy Institute poll reported that for the first time in Lowy Institute polling, this is a quote, a majority, 54%, a 14% rise from 2017, of Australians say the total number of migrants coming to Australia each year is too high. Australians also appear to be questioning the impact on national identity, i.e. the ideology of multiculturalism. This is hopeful. I mean, that was 7 years ago. And we are certainly all becoming aware that a lot of Australians are waking up and looking around their cities, particularly if they're living in the metropoles, and saying, hey, this isn't Australia anymore. You know, I love Adelaide, and I was in Adelaide last year, and I was just looking around Adelaide, and it wasn't Australia. It really wasn't. There's been a radical change that had taken place. The universities are to a large extent responsible for a lot of it. What is an Australian? Well, that's going to be one of the themes of tonight. I'll probably come back to it a little bit later. The other thing that we need to bear in mind is that the more we bring migrants in who want family members to follow them on family reunion schemes, the more Australians will be pro-migration and pro-multiculturalism. This is the thing. We're creating through immigration, we're creating a pro-immigration and pro-multicultural demographic. This is what is going on. And so pretty soon the surveys are not going to mean anything. They barely mean all that much now. On assimilation, I think we've got to take a realist view on assimilation. And the truth is that assimilation is somewhat mythical. There's no such thing as full assimilation, I don't think. Now, there are probably some sort of exceptions. I think for, say, North Europeans are going to much more easily assimilate into mainstream Australian culture than more Southern Europeans. I'm married to a Greek woman, so I have some experience with that as well. Strictly speaking, when we say that the post-World War II European migrants assimilated, what we really mean is that to a degree much greater than many present-day migrants, they adopted the prevailing Anglo-Celtic culture. But they never fully assimilated. For example, Greeks did not come and become Anglicans, Presbyterians, or Catholics. They stayed Greek Orthodox for the most part. Similar things can be said for other migrant groups. For me personally, I'm very public on the record about this, and maybe for obvious reasons, I greatly cherish the broader European contribution after World War II. I actually do think it brought us something that complemented us beautifully. A good test of how reliable a politician or policy architect will be on the immigration and culture question will be the extent to which they lean on the concept of Australian values, as opposed to the Anglo-Celtic heritage. I'm at a point at which I simply cannot trust any MP to get immigration and culture right if they insist on appealing to Australian values as a paradigm of integration. What we have witnessed over the past 30 years is the simple fact that the Australian values paradigm has been used as little more than a Trojan horse to let any group of people into Australia, regardless of the kinds of communities they create, and all justified by the assurance that no matter how different they seem, they are really essentially conforming to Australian values. In Australian values in this context, if you try to figure out what they mean, something like this, it translates to, well, they vote in elections, they're not arranging a forced marriage for their daughters, although there have been several parliamentary inquiries into forced marriages for daughters. They're not killing people of a different religion, and they're paying their taxes. A pretty low threshold for Australian values there. This is apparently what it means now to be an Australian. The Australian values paradigm has, in my opinion, been a pernicious aspect of our immigration and integration program. The truth is that people come to Australia not as blank slates, but as bearers of thick cultural traits. Vague notions of Australian values have no power in the face of such thick cultural traits. People do not, and this is probably, if there's one key thing I want you to take away tonight, it's this, and it really dawned on me over the last few months. People do not assimilate into vague, abstract values. They assimilate into living cultural practices exemplified by an overwhelmingly dominant ethnic majority. That is what people assimilate to. Thus, when the post-World War II migrants came to Australia, the Anglo-Celtic majority was a supermajority. It was overwhelming, which meant it was inescapable and exerted a strong force in reshaping most who arrived on our shores from European cultures very different from the British. Almost all of them being Christian also helped. Consider a man who migrates to Australia from Afghanistan. Let's call him Muhammad Jihad. You laugh. It's funny, I was at a Domino's Pizza in Glebe one night, and I was waiting. It was a late night pizza run for myself, and the guy before me, you could see the screen, the names, and the guy's name waiting for his pizza was Jihad. Muhammad Jihad loves meat pies. He loves the footy. He also votes and basically pays his taxes. He doesn't harass women any more than the average Aussie man, and he votes in every election. He's also a Muslim and attends mosques regularly enough, speaks Arabic mostly around his family and close friends, but speaks English pretty decently when he needs to. According to the Aussie values approach, Muhammad Jihad is as much an Aussie as anyone in this room because he doesn't violate abstract values, abstract Aussie values. In other words, the Australian values approach to immigration cannot justify why Muhammad Jihad might be prioritized as an immigrant over David Smith from England or New Zealand. Bring in 100,000 Mohammeds and their wives, and you will have established a parallel society that may not look exactly like the societies they left, but which at the same time most definitely do not look like the rest of society they have just come to. And on top of that, because of the ideology of multiculturalism, we're supposed to say that there's nothing un-Australian, nothing out of keeping with national culture about such a parallel society. You can't even talk about a national culture with the ideology of multiculturalism because all we are just an archipelago of cultures. Fast forward to 2025, after 75 years of pretty steady migration, with a lot of it from non-Anglo-European regions, and the Anglo-Celtic supermajority is pretty much gone, and there now exist large ethnic communities that new immigrants can immediately join. In other words, the gravitational pull of Anglo-Celtic culture is much weaker than it once was, and thus it is not only not very clear as to exactly what individuals must assimilate into, but the dominant force of Anglo-Celtic Australia is tremendously weakened, especially in the capital cities and surrounding suburbs. This means that our national identity, if things keep going the way they go, is going to fade and fade and fade away, and what people are going to basically do is turn inwards into their own ethnic groups, and we will simply become an archipelago of ethnicities, and that, history teaches us, will become something that is very unstable because it will also fall prey to events taking place outside of Australia that we can't control, events between Hindus and Muslims in India and Pakistan, events between Jews and Muslims over in the Middle East, and goodness knows whatever else might happen. We will feel it all here. This has the obvious implication that we do need to be ethnically selective in our immigration program. I would also challenge the nation. So I challenge the notion that an immigration system that takes race into account is thereby racist. It is not. If ethnic and racial homogeneity, I say, not necessarily purity, but if ethnic and racial homogeneity are good things for a nation to have, then an immigration system that takes ethnicity and race into account may be described as racialist, but not racist. This is because the racialist aspect is not necessarily premised on racial hierarchies or even negative racial stereotypes. It's simply grounded in a national good that any nation has a right to wish to preserve, that is, ethnic homogeneity and the social goods that result from this. And there's a whole literature on this. You can read David Goodhart. David Goodhart wrote a book. The title of it escapes me, but the more ethnic and racial homogeneity a nation has, the higher social solidarity you get, the higher social trust you get, and that actually also means that the more effective and better a welfare system you can have if you're into those kinds of things. And so there are completely non-racist justifications for an immigration policy that does actually take ethnicity and race into account. Now, I've been asked to offer a note of optimism. From history even. I often define a historian as someone who has a morbid fascination with life. For history doesn't offer much in the way of optimism, I'm sorry to tell you all, or at least optimism without a large dose of pessimism. I've said on many occasions now that I'm a pessimistic optimist. Things may well get better, but they'll almost certainly have to get worse first. Today, it does look as if much of Europe, the UK and America has woken up, and we can see a fight back in progress. So that's fantastic. Great things happening in England especially. But that was after years of terrorism, harassment of women, increasing rape statistics and crime, and streets feeling increasingly unsafe and just no-go zones. Australia is not quite there yet. But we can also see a lot of resistance from the media, state technocrats, activists and politicians. There's no doubt an emerging voice in Australia that's not just against further mass immigration, but which is awake to the decline of Australia's national identity. Perhaps Australians may be spared the traumas that England has gone through over the past 20 years if European countries begin to go down the path of deporting criminals and antisocial elements, as well as holding out opportunities for remigration. If other countries, namely Germany, France, England, and America in particular, do this, then that could open the Overton window to that conversation here in Australia and furnish us with what we might call a permission structure to do the same without having to go through the trials that the Europeans and Americans have had to go through to get to this point that they're at. Both major parties in Australia, however, are locked into infinity immigration and the ideology of multiculturalism. However, I do think we have seen now the beginning of a revival of pro-Australia, anti-mass migration sentiment, and it was certainly most evident in the recent March for Australia that took place in the major cities and regions. So here are some points to finish on, points of direction perhaps. Number one, we need to start just openly criticising as divisive, nationally self-loathing and socially corrosive the ideology of multiculturalism. We've just got to start attacking that ideology every chance we can get. I think it will catch on. I think if we can just openly say the ideology of multiculturalism is a nationally suicidal ideology, it will catch on. So we've got to just not beat around the bush and just openly attack. Anytime a politician uses this word, attack, attack, attack. Pile on, pile on, pile on. Two, we need to abandon talk of Australian values. I don't want to hear that anymore, Aussie values, and talk about the Anglo-Celtic heritage and character of Australia. Exactly what percentage of Australia is Anglo-Celtic now is not necessarily that easy to tell. Recent censi returned that 51% of Australians identify as having either English, Scot or Irish heritage. The Welsh should be there somewhere, but I couldn't find that one. But you're there, for all the Williams here. But there is another category of heritage simply called Australian, and this is what makes it complicated, which around about 14% of people tick. And what experts in the stats say is that Australian is probably ticked basically by white Australians, but you would have a lot of non-white Australians probably ticking it as well. We don't know exactly how many. And so you would probably say at the most, sort of the Anglo-Celtic population of Australia would be at the most hovering around about 64, 65%. If you add Europeans to this, it's actually hard to find all the stats, and I found that probably the most reliable thing to do is if you want to find out how many Australians are basically Anglo-Celtic European, you subtract all people who identify from an ethnic background that is not Anglo-Celtic European, and you wind up with a figure of somewhere between 72 to 75%. That's what I could find. And so what do I mean by it? Why would I bring that up? To say that Australia is multicultural, to me, is just a massive insult to over 75% of Australians whose cultural heritage created this country. Our parliament, our economic system, I would say the national sentiment in general is powerfully Anglo-Celtic, absolutely post-World War II European, and you had pre-World War II Europeans who came here and did fantastic stuff as well, but the post-World War II Europeans came to something that already existed. And as many people have been saying lately, the first fleeters and the first few generations of people who came here, they were not immigrants, because there was nothing other than a mass of land to immigrate to. They were, I like to call them, they were creators. They were creators. And immigrants are the people who came to that which had been created, and then many of them made beautiful improvements, in my opinion. Some of them, not so much. And we've got to deal with that. We've got to resist the temptation to reduce, this is so important. We've got to reduce the temptation to reduce the immigration debate solely to economics. It's all about housing prices, or it's all about GDP. Those are important, don't get me wrong. But it's also a cultural identity debate. And there is a strong ethnic and racial component. And we need to be clear that it is not racist to want Anglo-Celtic, and we could add European Australia, to remain a majority in this country. That is not a racist proposition. You would not accuse the Japanese for wanting racially ethnically Japanese people to remain a supermajority. That's not a racist thing that they want. These are the people who created something. It is perfectly legitimate for them to want that heritage to continue. And the fact of the matter is that as much as any immigrant comes to Australia and loves Australia, they will not continue that heritage. They will not love it as much as those whose families were a part of that heritage will love it. They simply will not. I appreciate the Anzac heritage of Australia, but I have friends whose both sides of the family are Anglo-Celtic, and I can just tell that they appreciate it much more than I do, because again, my father didn't really care that much about it. He didn't spurn it, but his first language was Russian. You know, his grandparents came from Eastern Europe. He didn't care about it all that much. And the fact of the matter is that over time, that makes a difference to a nation. When you bring lots of people over whose families in no way really identify with the history of a nation, it changes things. They might pay their taxes. They might raise the GDP. But the nation is changing. And this is not a sort of an anti-change speech that I'm giving. What I'm opposed to is change that isn't organic, change that is being mechanically engineered from the top purely for ideological and economic reasons. As some people here have been pointing out, we've got some real legends on social media who've been saying great things lately. The change really needs to start at the grassroots level. We cannot trust the mainstream politicians to do this. The mainstream of the major parties. They cannot be trusted to do it. If there are some who would agree with what I'm saying, there just are not enough of them. We need to start grassroots movements in Australia to promote Anglo-Celtic Australian identity and heritage. We cannot trust schools to do any of it, and so it must fall to parents and community volunteers. By the way, I don't blame non-Anglo-Celtic and European migrants for not being that interested in our heritage. I don't blame them. Why should they be? Like, they've got their own heritage. They've got their own lives. It's not their fault. And one of the things we've got to be really careful about here is not be blaming all of this on immigrants. If you had a garbage country and a great country held out an invitation to you and said, hey, why don't you come over here and make a better life for yourself? Wouldn't you go? Of course you'd go. Any of us would go. And so it's not their fault. I mean, some of them absolutely need to be kicked out, for sure. For sure. Put on a boat and sent back to wherever the hell they came from. But it is not it is the fault of treacherous politicians, activists, and all sorts of people working behind the scenes. But we need to start a grassroots movement. Teach classic Anglo-Celtic Australian literature. Remake or rewatch the classic films for a new generation. We've got to remake Smiley Gets a Gun. I don't know if anyone knows about that film. Watch a great movie. Go watch Smiley Gets a Gun. It'll bring a tear to your eyes. A children's film from the 1950s. There's some old Australia there for you. The goal will be to create a sense of identity among Anglo-Celtic Australians. And again, if it's not strange for Greeks, Italians, Chinese and Ugandans to have a strange sense of ethnic identity, why should it be so strange or dubious for Anglo-Celts to do the same? And I know for a fact, I know a lot of people from more southern Europe. They'd be all on board with this. They love this country. I mean, again, look, this is something I was talking to Dr. McInerney about earlier. What we need to start distinguishing between is people who love Australia and people who love their life in Australia. When I say I love Australia, what do I mean by that? I don't mean, gee, I got some money in my back pocket, life's pretty easy, much better than anywhere else in the world. That's not what I mean. That's part of it. But really, when I say I love Australia, what I mean is I love the Australian people. I love the Anglo-Celtic heritage. I love that this was settled as a convict colony and they turned something so inauspicious into just one of the best countries in the world. I love the Anzac tradition. I love the quirky nature of the Australian iteration of Britishness. I love so much about this country. I love the people. I love the history. I love the heritage. I love the Indigenous aspect. I love the historical interrelation and often camaraderie between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia. You see it, for example, in the film Crocodile Dundee. There's something just beautiful and uniquely Australian about it. I love it all. When I think about it, I almost want to cry. When I think about, as a child, 1988, peak Australia. We had the bicentenary. We had the Brisbane World Expo. We loved this country. We loved one another. We were kicking goals internationally. We had just never been prouder of ourselves. I love that. That's what I mean when I say I love Australia. I don't just mean this place gives me a better life than the place where I came from. And those are two very, very different things. And if we lose that distinction, we lose Australia forever. God bless you all, and God bless Australia.